Welcome to the second video on happiness. The first video focused on the public perceptions of happiness, whereas this video will focus on the biology of happiness and how chemicals in the brain affect how we feel. I interviewed Dr. Mark Talbot, a doctor of palliative care, to ask how this works.
I suppose in medical terms you have pleasure, and you have desire, and perhaps contentedness as well. And I think those terminologies are certainly very different ones. But if I focus on pleasure, for instance, it is known from animal experiments and from trials in human beings that there are pleasure centers in the brain, and these are activated by endogenous opioids and endorphins. So these are substances that, to a degree, our own body produces, that stimulate areas in the brain that make us feel good. And I won't say that that is happiness, but I will say that most people, when these areas are stimulated or activated, feel good. And there's a lot of research and there's a lot of focus on how much endogenous, and by endogenous I mean how much intrinsic levels of these chemicals are within our bodies. Some people may have more, some people may have less, some people may be more reactive to these endogenous opioids, and some people may be less reactive to those endogenous opioids. And what does that mean? But so that's pleasure. I suppose there's also the aspect which is more focused on desire. So you may be someone who is very desire driven, you might have certain aspirations and goals in life, you might have academic goals, you have academic desires, you might have sexual desires, and that might make you a person who really focuses and tries and achieve those areas. And the desire centers in your brain are again a completely different area and a completely different zone of stimulation. And achieving those desires, I suppose, will then again activate certain areas of your brain, for instance, the dopamine system. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter in the brain which has attracted a lot of attention in the medical research world, because it is known that people with high responsiveness to dopamine are very get a certain amount of thrill, get a certain amount of, I won't call it happiness, but a certain amount of pleasure. You can call it thrill-seeking behaviors. For instance, if you have someone who likes bungee jumping, at the end of the bungee jump they will release a huge amount of dopamine, and a lot of people desire to have that sensation, to have that thrill, to have that good feeling, that buzz that's going through your body. A lot of that is to do with dopamine, and whether some people have higher levels of dopamine naturally or lower levels is again a focus of research. So do we all have roughly the same amounts of dopamine in our brains, or are we just differently receptive? Do we have different receptiveness to dopamine within our brains? And the interesting aspect of that is that a lot of people have try and artificially enhance the dopamine system in their brain by taking substances such as cocaine, taking opioids, taking psychostimulants, all of which have a direct impact on the dopamine system. And again, it is clear that people have different desires to do this. Some people may not be interested at all in actually activating the dopamine system in their brain by taking drugs, and others have a far higher desire to do so. And again, I think that brings it back to the reward behaviors that we seek. So reward for some people is far more important and far more central to their lives in achieving perhaps happiness than for others.
get enough sleep. Having more sleep will give you more energy and make you feel better. Get regular exercise. Regular exercise will make you feel healthier and better. So try to eat healthily. Do some research about diet and the kind of nutrients that you should be getting into your body. By eating healthily, you'll feel better. You can treat yourself from time to time, but make it a treat. Don't make this an eating habit.
Dopamine is a substance within your body. It's a chemical, a neurotransmitter, which helps nerve cells, communicate with one another. There's a number of areas in the brain that are very abundant in so-called dopamine receptors. Dopamine receptors, if you like, attract dopamine molecules and then produce a certain electrical stimulus or reaction within the brain. A lack of dopamine can cause diseases such as Parkinson's, and you often find that people with Parkinson's disease get very flat, they get very expressionless, they find it very difficult to move, and there's a huge incidence of sadness, depression, and that is a consequence of a lack of dopamine within your body. So dopamine is a molecule, a chemical that helps cells communicate with one another within the brain. There's been some research, there's a lot of research that's focusing on the fact whether we all have similar amounts of dopamine within our brain and just have different levels of receptiveness to dopamine, or whether we have different levels of dopamine in our brain and have a similar amount of receptiveness, or a bit of both, if that makes sense. There are a number of other neurotransmitters which are important. There's noradrenaline, for instance, and there is serotonin. Again, these are sort of transmitters. If you have nerve cells that communicate with one another, these substances are in between these nerve cells, and they help the communication, the sort of wiring, if you like, of the nerve cells within the brain. And a lot of antidepressant drugs focus on this very interaction. The theory being that a lack of neurotransmitters within nerve cells can make you more prone or more likely to depression and sadness. And a lot of the substances that you take for depression will try and avoid the diminution of these neurotransmitters within these nerve cells, within these clusters. Again, I'm careful I want to be careful about linking dopamine to happiness, and I know it's been called the happiness chemical, the happiness molecule. I'm not necessarily sure that's true. I'm sure having high receptiveness to dopamine, having frequent episodes of dopamine elevation, if you like, probably are conducive to someone feeling pleasure, feeling certain short-term happiness within their life. I'm not sure if it actually is the recipe to sort of long-term happiness, and I think that's a different construct altogether. I'm very eager to describe to you that I think desire and pleasure-seeking behaviors are not necessarily the way to achieving a longer-term contentedness and peacefulness, if you like, which I think I equate with happiness personally.
So there are various chemicals in the brain like dopamine and noradrenaline that allow us to feel pleasure and desire, and by creating positive habits such as getting enough sleep, doing exercise and eating well, we can boost our mental health and give ourselves more energy. But is this happiness? In the next video I'll continue to explore this topic and gain a more personal perspective. Till then, keep smiling.